G'day everyone, welcome back to Frontlines and Faultlines with Mike Kelly. It's great to have you back, and we're very lucky today to be able to talk to Professor Sean Turnell, who's a very renowned academic in terms of his base levels of expertise on economics, and he's had so many appointments that reflect that, and he's the Honorary Professor of Economics at Macquarie University in Sydney at present, where he also, I think that's where Sean got his PhD. So he's had a long association with Macquarie, but he's also been deploying that expertise practically all over the place, including as a senior analyst at the Reserve Bank of Australia. But we're talking to Sean today particularly about his incredible experience and passion for Myanmar, formerly known as Burma. And he's had very deep engagement with that country and was particularly focused on its economic development, bringing all of his expertise to the service of his fellow human beings in that country. That was the motivation. And he was the director of research at the Myanmar Development Institute as well. And in particular, the most fascinating part of this is from 2016 to 2021, he was the senior economic advisor to Myanmar's state councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, who people will know that name and know of her for sure. But he played a pivotal role in the country's economic reform initiatives. And then I think probably more famously, unfortunately, for all of his pains and his labours of love, ended up as a guest of the dictatorship or the oligarchy, whatever you want to call it, the military coup that took over that country, decided that he was some kind of threat to the state. And he ended up being a guest of that regime in one of their salubrious prison facilities, which we'll hear more about from Sean. So thanks for being with us, Sean. I really appreciate you taking the time out to talk to us. And you're talking to us from Vietnam, actually. So obviously spent a bit of time in broader aspects of the region. So welcome aboard, mate. Great to have you.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Good on you, mate. So, look, when we talk about your expertise and your background, is there anything else that you feel was important to shaping you as the sort of things that you were interested in life that you wanted to concentrate on? Why economics and why Myanmar?
Yeah, well, so the Myanmar aspect was an accident. I sort of got associated with the country and its people when I was a PhD student at Macquarie, as you pointed out, Mike, and was in a share house where somebody there was from Myanmar or Burma, as it was then. And I gradually got called into the whole democracy movement. There were many Burmese refugees in Australia. And when they heard I was an economist, they asked me to help them critique the military regime that was in place back then in the 90s and to come up with new policies and things like that. But yeah, economics has always been my passion, but in particular, the institutions that are needed for economic development. So in a sense, all of my worlds, the economic world, the academic world, and, just a personal interest in Burma all just came together. And as you say, ultimately led me to the country.
Right. And I get the impression from what I've read about you, and it's a real pleasure to actually meet you live, but that, your motivations behind all that was like, how do I make my world a better place? What can I kind of bring to that story? And that obviously economics is probably one of the most fundamental dimensions of trying to make the world a better place with, equity and social justice tied into all of those things and making it possible for people to live lives that are a bit above having to slow through the terrible environments they might live in, or uplift them generally. Is that been your motivation?
Absolutely, Mike. So my whole work in economics has always been based on the idea that economics is not just balance sheets and profits and capital ratios and things like that, but it's really the foundation for our society. It sort of makes the world, if you like, safe for democracy, safe for rising living standards, all that sort of thing. So yeah, always been very comprehensive. And also the other way around as well, that economics itself is really shaped by history, politics, and all of that. So yeah, so it all sort of, it's a much bigger universe, the economics universe than we sometimes think.
Yeah, it's the one thing I think I really appreciate about your approach to this is for you, it's about people and not about spreadsheets and a dry academia approach to economics. That at the end of the day, it is about what people have got to, in terms of putting food in their mouths and how they look after their kids and what sort of shelter they live in and roof over their head, all those sort of things. So really appreciate that about you, mate. And interestingly, obviously Myanmar is one of those countries we often describe as being in developing world. But how did you actually end up there, physically? When did you first arrive in Myanmar? How did that come about?
Yeah, so as I said, mate, I got interested in Myanmar in the 1990s, started writing academic papers on it, started writing policy proposals for the democracy movement in exile, which of course was headed by Aung San Suu Kyi, but she was imprisoned in Myanmar at the time. So I started writing policy papers for her, got to know her virtually, if you like, although this was before the internet, so it was just in terms of swapped letters through the American ambassador, actually.
Right.
So, yeah, sort of created a foundation that way, mate. Then when she was released from house arrest in 2010, I went over there, met her, we got on really well. I continued to write papers for her and for the exile movement. Then finally in 2015, the military regime thought it was incredibly popular. So it had an election and absolutely was wiped out off the electoral map, so to speak.
Self-awareness. I mean, who knew?
Exactly, mate. And the very morning after the election, I went round to Aung San Suu Kyi's house and I said, look, congratulations and all that. She said to me, well, Sean, this is all great, but, you've been helping us out all these years, but it's really time to put your money where your mouth is. Why don't you come over and give us a hand? We've got 5 years,
Right.
first term of government, come over. And it just so happened, mate, that same evening, I met the Australian ambassador in Rangoon, and I told him about this invitation, more than an invitation, if you like.
Right.
And he said, well, look, do you want to do it? And I said, yeah, but look, how can I do it? I'm an academic. I've got exams to mark. I've got classes to take. I've got all that.
Day job.
And he said, a day job. But he said, look, it sounds like a good idea to us. If you want to do it, let's do it. And so literally within a few weeks, DFAT had cleared all the obstacles. And within a few months, mate, I was on the ground in Myanmar and working alongside Suu Kyi and all of her ministers, but particularly, the key economic reformers.
Right. So the Australian government sort of anteed up and supported that deployment for you, basically, as a kind of a contribution diplomatically and in a development sense.
That's right, Mike. I was told at one point by somebody in DFAT that it was the fastest they'd ever seen DFAT move. So,
Yes. That's
yeah.
yeah, that would be impressive unless you know how fast DFAT moves. So it's all relative.
Indeed, right?
Yeah, I must say they're improving a lot these days. They've been reaching out to us here at UC about how we can help with, what they're doing with Ukraine, etc. So
Brilliant.
come along nicely there. A few bright people have been talking to us, but it was great to see that they backed you in because it could be so impactful to get those issues right. I mean, I contrast it, for example, with how when we saw Russia transitioning from communism and the Soviet Union into what was supposed to be a democracy, it's kind of hasn't worked out. But one of the key reasons why it hasn't worked out is because the advice, in inverted commas, that was being given about economic transition there was so badly handled. It was this theory of the short, sharp shock and that transitioning state-owned enterprises where you just do this share issue thing and all it did was lay the groundwork for the creation of these oligarchs and then the poisoning and corrupting of the economy because of all of that, and how then Putin has been able to harness those oligarchs and change them over for his own oligarchs to control the economy and to create revenue streams for what he wants to do, but a completely ham-fisted approach to it. So to have you there to help with Myanmar was obviously a good idea at the time.
Yeah, no, exactly, Mike. And you're right to point out the story in Russia and all that because our whole MO, if you like, was actually with all that in mind, with the lessons of that, the lessons of Eastern Europe, what worked, what didn't, what worked with the Asian tiger economies, how did they
Right.
get growth, etc. And then in combination with knowledge of the country itself, because there's various aspects to do with the culture, to do with history that might mean that a policy that, say, worked in Poland and the Czech Republic might not work in Myanmar and vice versa. So,
Mm.
yeah, so very much a deliberate attempt to learn all that we could, avoid the traps, and trying to come up with something that would be, just fit Myanmar. And yeah, the good thing about it, mate, is that DFAT were totally on board with that as
Right.
well. So I think, of course, I would say this, but I think it was a good use of our aid money,
Yep.
with many sort of multipliers, I think, because, it was essentially just to employ one person, me. But yeah, I'm hopeful that we had an impact that would have been, many times that.
Yeah, what a value add. And I'm so delighted to hear you sort of surface the fact that the astuteness of your approach to this about understanding that whatever you do, it's got to take with the system, the cultural context. It's kind of like I used to liken it to an organ transplant situation where, whatever you're doing, the grafter's got to take. And to be able to take it needs to fit, match with the cultural context. Otherwise, the body's going to reject it. And I watched this happen so many times in all the deployments that I was involved in, where people want to come in and we're going to have elections and we're going to write all this legislation and do this, that, and the other. And it meant nothing unless you had a cultural process of embedding the moving forward and, becoming democratic. It was going to take generations in some places, and what sort of reforms and efforts we put in place. And you obviously went in there with eyes wide open about that and did your due diligence on understanding that cultural context.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Mike. The only thing is, I wish I'd heard that metaphor before because that's actually a really good one about an organ transplant. Because I think that's exactly right. That it should work, etc., whatever the policy is. But yeah, it may be rejected given the cultural and historical purposes, and also I think, mate, in all of that, just remaining really, really flexible. So as the reforms are going out,
Right.
I'm getting sort of advice from my Burmese colleagues, and they'll say things like, well, look, Sean, we get this. We understand that this logically works, but you have to understand in Burmese culture, this, and this
Right.
means that it won't work in this context. So, yeah, so it was a constant sort of thing, mate, of just not being dogmatic,
Right.
but at the same time, not like having some idea of direction, because obviously that's important,
Mhm.
but keeping it flexible enough.
Right.
And then, of course, as you know very well, mate, life has a way of just throwing things at you. So even apart from being flexible, for culture and history, just being flexible to events.
Right.
And particularly in a country like that where, you're on a wild ride. And so you've got to be sort of, just adapting to things as they come at.
Right. Yeah. Find those cultural hooks and be prepared to make it an evolutionary process. I think is really the patience and the perseverance you've got to show. So I'm just so glad to hear you talk about that. It's something all of our policymakers need to understand. But so you get there and you've done this kind of due diligence and you're engaging closely and learning as you go. What sort of approach were you kind of looking to do in Myanmar to uplift that country economically?
Yeah, so the major thing, Mike, was to get the foundations and the institutions right. So Myanmar is a place so it was given independence from the Brits in 48. At that point, it was probably the richest country in Southeast Asia.
Right.
It had the iron frame of the British civil service. It had very widespread use of English. And for all of those reasons, it was thought that it would be the country in Southeast Asia that would make it first, as becoming a rich industrial country. And it was sort of making some progress in that way from 48 to 62. Then there was a military coup. Then they fell into a very doctrinaire brand of socialism
Right.
or communism, really, along the lines of of North Korea's. Like, it was that extreme.
Right.
So the economy just took a massive dive. And then even though they gradually abandoned the most extreme socialism of that period, we get right up into the 2000s and it's still, very much a dictatorship, very much behind, no market mechanisms, everything just by command. And so the economy, it was by then, the poorest country in Southeast Asia, from that wonderful starting point. It's now the poorest. So where I'm going on this way is just to say that we really had to lay the foundations. It was almost, from nothing, which in a sense is a bit of an advantage because you can start with sort of first principles.
Right. Blank sheet of
But
paper.
yeah, exactly, mate. But I don't want to exaggerate that that's easy at all. But we did then have a basic plan of getting the fiscal situation on board. So trying to rein in government spending, lots of money printing and all that. So just get some sort of sound finance, public finance as a starting point, because we found that often the problems ran off that. If you've got a government that is just printing money to fund itself,
Right.
doesn't have a tax system, doesn't have a bond market or all the things that we'd want to see for good public finances. So, you get all sorts of economic problems just go from that. So, yeah, getting that foundation right, and then essentially like just opening things up, allowing Burmese people to do things, because the biggest barrier to the economy in Burma for the longest time was just, this state that restricted economic activity, that the state was involved in everything. And of course, whenever you get state involvement at that extent, you get endemic corruption as well,
Yeah,
So,
right.
trying to open things up, bring in competition, and open things to the world, not
Mhm.
not just for Burmese to be able to do what they wanted and create the businesses they needed and all that, but opening up to the world, getting technological transfer, skills transfer, opening a conversation, if you like, from Myanmar to the rest of the world. So,
Right.
so it was really that foundational. Then we had, all sorts of specific policies, getting the banks right because they're the ultimate distributors of credit and all that capital. But the big thing, laying those critical foundations, rule of law. We had a sort of democracy by 2015, but just laying those foundations and then, basically trusting then what to say, sort of the get up and go of the Burmese people, which has always been underestimated, but I think was always there.
Right.
The average Burmese person had to be entrepreneurial to survive.
Right.
So, in a sense, we were trying to create an economy in which that would be, economic growth out of it.
Right. Yeah, this is the thing that strikes me too, is because I've studied closely aid and development initiatives around the world and in the developing world, is often associated with the sort of deployment situations we were in. And there was a couple of common themes that hold back your efforts to uplift these countries. One is corruption. You mentioned when you get this situation, when you have these vested interests that are embedded with no controls, corruption's the first thing that happens. And there's the staggering proportion of aid money in Africa, for example, and the Middle East that would end up in Swiss bank accounts, and what we call kleptocracies. So the first thing was, well, how do you actually create accountability and regulatory aspects to that? And, I think about how over a couple of 100 years we've evolved things like the securities regulation, we've got labour laws, we've got environmental laws, we've got competition frameworks. In the States, they call the trust framework that they built there, but also, we had Trade Practices Acts and whatnot in Australia, all to try and create equitable and fair competition, and then the ability for people to have free and innovative thoughts and to, openly challenge and dispute things to spur entrepreneurialism and innovation. All of those things are so absent in these places that need to be grown. But unless you come in with a kind of regulatory framework to start with, and then the ability to actually monitor all of that, the accountability mechanisms and systems to track where money is flowing. You're really pushing it uphill.
Yeah, totally, mate. And we were pushing it uphill, actually, because, so it went from this, very strong state socialism and then to an economy that I guess we use the word crony economy,
Right.
and in fact, very like Russia's is today. So a bunch of oligarchs controlling most of the industries, etc. And of course, they're going to resist the reforms. So even though we had a plan of opening it up and all that, of course, whenever you're talking about opening up, bringing in competition, of course, the people who gain from a lack of competition, who have got everything stitched up,
Right.
they're not going to like it. And they're going to push back. And of course, ultimately, the tragedy for Myanmar is that they won in the end, which I'm sure we'll come to. But
Yes.
but it was a real struggle, and exactly as you say, though, bring in the sort of right regulatory framework, open things up to competition and break up that oligarchy, just try to free the economy up. So all that was much more important than simply spending money.
Right.
It's just getting that message across. And then once you've done that, you can start spending on infrastructure. And of course, you want to try and divert expenditure away from the military into health and education, create human capital. So you've got that going as well. But the initial thing was just to sort of, open things up to people other than these sort of cronies and their connections in the state.
Right. And so what did you identify as the potential strengths that of a Myanmar economy that was going to be more dynamic and open and offer the potential for growth? What sort of strands did you identify as things that could be, I guess, either accelerated or promoted in achieving the development goals you'd be looking at there?
Yeah, so I think the first thing was agriculture. Myanmar is very much an agricultural country, and in fact, going back to the British Empire days, it was often called the rice bowl of the British Empire, by which they meant actually the rice bowl of India.
Right.
So Myanmar produced vast surpluses of rice in the Irrawaddy Delta, and that was exported across to India, which was then a really important figure in India's development. And the best evidence of that, I'm sure people will be aware of the famous famine took place in Calcutta, I think in about 42, the war. And the reason for that was because Burma had been cut off from India, so that sort of underlines the importance of that. So it had this incredibly productive agricultural sector, but that had no development at all, essentially for 50 years. So the tools, the implements, the technologies was frankly little more than Stone Age, and yet it was still really productive. So we thought that a focus on agriculture, getting investment, mechanization, and all that into agriculture would lift economic growth, lift living standards, and then be the basis of converting that into industrial development. Because Myanmar has got a young population, beginning to be better educated and all that. So then they'd sort of swing in for the basis of industrialization. And then I guess we had a vision from that point that, you'd be on the Asian tiger story, that Myanmar then would gradually move up the industrial production possibility curve, we
Right.
call it in economics,
Right.
and produce goods for exports. And that in turn, would encourage good policy. You'd have lots of capital inflow, and you start to get into a virtuous circle. So that was sort of the vision. I mentioned the workforce a little while ago, Mike, and just to stress that too, I suppose that, in a world of shrinking population, here was Myanmar with this very strong, large population who were desperate to see the world and wanted to know
Right.
things. It was so inspiring
Right.
to see the young people of Myanmar, their attitudes to education and so on. So in many ways, mate, I think, I've highlighted agriculture, but in many ways, the best resource, the biggest resource, most important
Human
resource was,
capital.
these young, exactly. Like they're just at the right, or as we saw at the right time.
Thirst for knowledge and experience and
Absolutely, mate. So so it looked all pretty good to us.
right. So education was obviously a key strand for what you were trying to do, but I guess if you're trying to address education and the need for that to be open and free, I guess now I'm starting to see where the regime may have looked at you as a threat because you're challenging their corruption and their, their sort of the luxurious lifestyles, and then the means by which they maintain their repression. We're trying to open up the education and create a sort of free system.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. I knew I was unpopular in certain circles in Myanmar amongst the cronies, but I don't think I realized how unpopular until much later. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, and it wasn't even just a matter of going after their money. Certainly that was central, implicit and central. But I think it was everything. I mean, you highlighted education, right? So just a very revealing comment that a military guy said to me in the prison, because I'd been complaining. I'm skipping ahead dramatically here, but it just illustrates the point. He said to me at one point after I complained I didn't have enough books, and he said, "I don't know what the problem is. You have a book."
So Chairman Mao's little red book, was it, or something like that?
It was virtually that. In fact, for a while, the only books I was allowed was sort of Buddhist scripture,
Right.
which at the time wasn't that enticing.
Right. Yeah, I think you sort of probably felt you were enlightened enough at that point, but this is certainly getting enlightened into the dark side of what was going on there in Myanmar by this stage.
Indeed.
Yeah. So, well, that's really interesting that you felt that potential was there, and obviously it had been demonstrated previously, as you said, by the strength of the Myanmar economy before it descended into this sump hole. So, did you sense that the broader population was really, there's obviously those young people who want their education, want to travel and all that, but the broader population, because it's a mixed population, and perhaps you could sort of tease that out a bit, the ethnic and religious and thought sort of framework that you have in Myanmar.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike, and I'm glad you brought that up, mate, because that was also an area of great difficulty, and in fact, of tragic difficulty later. So, yeah, so Myanmar is a mix of peoples. So the majority are the so-called Burma, and that's where we get the name Burma and the name Myanmar as well. It's just from that majority, and they're probably about 2/3 of the population. Then there's a whole host of other ethnic groups. Many of them will be familiar to listeners, people like the Karen, the Kachin and so on, of course, who had very strong associations with Australia and with Britain and so on in World War II. Mon, the Rohingya, various ethnic nationalities in the country. And one of Myanmar's most problematic aspects is that it's always been ruled from the centre, whether it be Burmese kings or the imperial framework when it was a British colony, whatever it was, ruled from the centre. And that's meant that many of the ethnic nationalities have just never had a proper say in the ruling of the country. And so there's a lot of sort of bad attitudes, if you like, over that issue, a lot of tension in Myanmar, which is often then exploited by the regimes that have taken over the country at various points, setting one group against another and so on. So that was a particular issue that we had to grapple with all the way through. And I'd have to confess, Mike, on this front, the civilian government was very much only half successful, I would say. And in fact, I think they were pulled into a trap that the military had long set to create division in Myanmar. I think many people will know that there were terrible atrocities that had took place, actually going way back in time, but sort of reignited in 2017 against the Rohingya minority, who were a group over near Bangladesh, a Muslim community, and it was very easy for sort of rabble-rousers in the country to whip up hate against them, and then the military actually moved against them. And there were, as I say, terrible atrocities took place.
Right.
I think it's all very controversial, of course. I think that Aung San Suu Kyi and the civilian government tried to alleviate the situation. I think they miscalculated, frankly. I think they underestimated just how ruthless, in a sense, the issue would be exploited.
Right.
And so, yeah, it led, I think, for Aung San Suu Kyi as a person, but the civilian government to really fall in the esteem of, I think, the international community.
Right.
So that added of course, another layer of difficulty if you're trying to reform and open up, because many people around the world are saying, well, look, do we want to be in a country like Myanmar? There's these atrocities taking place regardless of
investment
government.
and all the rest, yeah.
Exactly, mate. So it became a much harder row to hoe. I've got that metaphor wrong.
Yeah, very appropriate.
Much more, much more difficult task
Right.
after all that took place. And, and again, as we've been talking about, these things are cumulative, and you get into both, circles of uplift, but you can also get into downshifting as well. So, so you have these atrocities take place. That drives away foreign investors, which in turn then impacts upon economic growth. And then you sort of get more tension, more unhappiness, growth falls, and you can get into a downward spiral, So, yeah, but throughout the whole time, constantly trying to frame policy, if you will, not to exacerbate tensions, trying to alleviate them, but understanding all the way through that you've got an opposition that is going to push exactly those buttons,
Right.
so it became, incredibly difficult.
And the key divide there is the Rohingya's Muslim population, and the larger body of the community is in Buddhist faith. That's basically the divide they were talking about, Sean.
Yeah. Although, mate, to be honest, the Burmese military are equal opportunity oppressors, as we like to say. So they go after Christian groups as well. So
Right.
the people I mentioned before, the Karen, Kachin, and Jin, very much, or many of them Christian, but likewise Buddhists as well. Yeah, so the military will go after everyone.
Right.
But they did particularly exploit that issue over the Rohingya.
Classic old divide and rule theory, which probably learned from the British. But look, Sean, that's set us a great platform to go into the deeper dive that we'll do in the next program relating to what happened to you personally, and then to talk about how things unfolded in terms of the really shocking situation there, and what you can tell us about the latest situation. So thanks for giving us that base platform. I really appreciate your wisdom and insights into this, so that people won't get a better perspective on it than from you. So looking forward to teasing the rest of this out with you next time.
Thanks, Mike. I am too.
No worries. Well, thanks very much for being with us. I'm sure you will be really keen to hear more from Sean next time. That's going to be the really fascinating part of this story, both personally and understanding what's going on in Myanmar. So don't forget to like and subscribe to help us keep all this going, and we'll see you again in the next program. Cheers.